look, I've done probably hundreds of interviews over the last almost 20 years, and rarely, I can't think ever, honestly, of someone who every question is interesting. You actually really, you kind of kept surprising me every time, and I can't tell you how enjoyable that is.
Welcome to Bonfire Conversations. I'm your host, Hamid Rezani Kufar, and today I'm joined by a Grammy-nominated legendary composer behind some of the most beloved games like Journey, Flow, the Banner Saga, Assassin's Creed Syndicate, and a recent standout from Stoic Studio, Towerborne. My guest is none other than Austin Wintory. In this conversation, Austin and I talk about childhood, grown up, meeting heroes, curiosity, and his creative process. Austin is a never-ending well of inspiration and knowledge, and we had so much fun doing this. Before we begin, just a quick heads up and an apology. We had a few internet issues during the recording, so Austin's video is stuttery in some parts. The audio, however, is totally clean, and trust me, the insights, honesty, and inspiration in this conversation more than make up for the visuals. Bonfire Conversations is available on YouTube and all the major podcast and streaming services. If you're enjoying this content, please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you so much. This is my conversation with Austin Wintory. It's so amazing talking to you finally, sir. So
the pleasure's mine. You've had so many of my friends on your show. I'm thrilled to be a part of it.
Yeah, it's amazing to talk to you, especially now, because if I had interviewed you back when I first started making music for games and when I first started listening to your music, and by the way, I think it was around 15 when Flow came out, and I would probably just ask you a bunch of dumb questions like, what DAW do you use, or what is your favorite compressor? Ironically, I still kind of want to ask those, and I will later on. But as I've grown and met amazing people with real experiences, I've realized something that when you sit down with someone like you, it's less about gear and more about wanting to sit around like a metaphorical bonfire to figure out the subtext of their lives, to really understand what drives and inspires them. So I'm really glad I'm talking to you now as I'm more mature, hopefully, and not back then.
Hopefully both of us are more mature.
Yeah. Let's start here. When you meet your heroes, the people you admire, what do you ask them, and what can someone actually learn from their heroes?
Well, that's a very that's an interesting question. No one's ever asked me that before. It's rare. I'm in a lucky position of having done a bunch of podcasts and things, and it's rare that someone will ask me a thing that I've never been asked. Awesome. Which is cool. It's also a very generous question. If you're sort of implicitly implying that that's sort of our dynamic in this moment, that's a very generous thing of you to even just imply. Yeah, I'm trying to think of an example of I've been lucky enough to meet a bunch of my heroes, and I'm trying to remember, like you were saying, the first times that I had that chance, I was very young. And so I said things very reflective of being very young. For example, I got to meet John Williams when I was 16. And I basically just said, I want to be a composer like you. That's about all I could muster. And he very politely said, oh, well, good luck, don't give up. And that was about it. That was, but I still felt like, holy shit, I've just been grazed by an Olympian. And, now I'm in the curious position of certain folks that I consider my heroes are also friends of mine. And it's a weird thing because I admire them so much. And yet we're able to just talk as people. Like an example, I hate to sort of name drop, but I guess since it's sort of directly relevant, but literally 5 seconds ago, I sent an email to John Powell.
Wow.
And like, unquestionably, he's a hero of mine. He's been in the business longer. You know, I was in high school when his career took off. So he's very much of sort of one generation older than me. He's not an old guy, but he's older than me, obviously. But you know, whenever we've talked, we've shared meals together and we've hung out at parties and things like that. And we tend to not talk about music. You know, it tends to be about life questions. You know, what do you deal with this? How do you know? I guess I ask my heroes the same kinds of questions I ask other people. Like, for example, I had dinner with a friend last night who's got 2 young kids. And I've found myself thinking a lot lately about people with young kids and how they regulate the screen time for those kids. It's a thing that my parents really have to think about. You know, we had computers and video games, but I also, without internet and social media, you know, there was only so much you could use it. I feel like, and I also played outside and rode my bike and did sort of generically normal little kid stuff that I thought that in hindsight was nicely well-rounded. But today you have a whole other consideration. And I have a lot of friends with young kids. I don't have young kids, but I have a lot of friends with young kids. And I find myself very curious about that. So I remember I was at an ASCAP event talking with John, you know, talking about that sort of stuff, because he took a lot of time off in his career at one point to be able to be more present as a dad. Because he had a teenage son who he was so busy with doing these huge Hollywood films that he could only be available so much, you know, and he realized, I don't want that. So he started doing just one movie a year, you know, kind of in order to really spend most of his time being a father. That's the kind of stuff I tend to ask about. It's really actually at the heart of the way you set up the question. I would if I'm thinking about, okay, how the hell does someone write something as brilliant as, you know, Horton Hears a Who, which I think is one of Powell's masterpieces, or obvious examples like How to Train Your Dragon or The Bourne Identity. You'll never get a satisfying answer going, how did you write The Bourne Identity? But if you, like you said, if you try to understand, you know, what was going on in your life at that point, were you happy? You know, was your marriage in a good place? Were you able to play with your kids on the weekends? All that kind of stuff, that informs the process in a way that's interesting. It might not tell you anything about their technique or their craft. But it's, you know, I don't know, it's interesting. Yeah, that's to me the kind of place that the conversation I find is most interesting to go to. I remember one time I was at the composer Alexander Courage, who everybody remembers for the, you know, he wrote bum 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 from Star Trek in the original. He scored the original series in the 60s and wrote the famous fanfare that they still use today. But he was, you know, he was an orchestrator. He was Jerry Goldsmith's go-to orchestrator for decades, and died maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I went to his funeral, which was a pretty small. It wasn't a big, giant, you know, event. He wasn't famous, even though so many people know that Star Trek fanfare. And I went with a friend of mine, and John Williams was there. They had known each other for half a century. And I remember having a moment where I was like, we were at the reception, and it was sort of a quiet moment. And a friend of mine said, Austin, you know, John, have you two met? Of course, John Williams wouldn't have remembered that I had met him on multiple occasions, because he meets a lot of people, and who am I? Nobody. So he was like, oh, you know, very nice to meet you. And my friend says, you know, Austin's a composer as well. And he said, oh yeah, what are you working on? And I was working on a horror film at the time called Grace. Actually, that makes me realize that this story takes place in 2008.
Wow.
I was working on this horror film called Grace, and I remember I had listened as part of my kind of research for that film. I was listening to some things, and I remember I was listening to a score of his. I've always liked sort of a bit of a hidden gem, because it's so opposite of the John Williams thing with the big sweeping melodies and whatnot. It's called Images, Robert Altman movie from 1970 or 71. And it's sort of the closest he ever came to scoring a kind of borderline avant-garde kind of score in film. And so I said, he said, what are you working on or something like that? I said, I'm actually working on a film, and I found myself recently listening to Images. And he just said, oh my God, but that one is so old. That was his response. It was like, what could you possibly learn from a score from the 70s? As if he expects a younger composer to only be interested in Hans Zimmer or something. I don't know. It was funny. He said it in a kind of joking way. And as is always the case with him, the conversation was pretty much immediately over. And he's very polite, but he tends to move on quickly because I think he's very private. But it was very funny where I had hoped to ask him a little bit more about it. But in hindsight, I don't know what I would have asked, because I would have been much more curious about what was going on in your life. Like when you see interviews with him where he talks about, losing his first wife, that's so much more illustrative of who he is than, like you said, what is the equivalent of asking, what is your doll? Which in his case is, what type of paper do you prefer? White or slightly yellow? These are not useful questions.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, anyway, I feel like I have to really think about this. What is the thing that you ask your hero? I suppose a question that I don't think I've ever actually asked anyone before, but certainly people have asked me on podcast type of questions is the classic sort of, what advice would you give your younger self? I actually would be curious. I have heard John Powell, for example, give an answer. He often will say, stop listening to so many film scores. That's a thing I hear him say a lot to young composers. He goes, the best film scores are ones that draw from the entirety of culture and the entirety of the canon of music. They don't just recycle the latest, you're not just looking at Interstellar and going, how can I riff on that? And he says there's too many young composers that are just, they can only see about 2 inches in front of their face. And he's like, get out of your bubble. I think that's very good advice. So, yeah, I suppose that would be a question that I should consider asking, my heroes. I can think of a good example. John Bryan, I would consider a hero. I think that guy's an absolute genius. And I got to sit next to him once on a bus for like an hour. We have the same agent, and it was his birthday party. And so he organized a bus for all of his friends and clients to go from this hotel to the Hearst Castle in Northern California. It was very weird, interesting, fun birthday weekend. And I remember I ended up sitting next to John Bryan, and we spent the entire conversation debating about and exploring how would we ideally like to die. My answer to that was, which he liked, it was different from his answer, but we talked about, I remember I said, my fantasy is if I knew I was going to die, like if I had a terminal disease, if a doctor said, look, we're not going to be able to beat your cancer, you have 1 year, then I think my ideal would be to be blasted off into space on a one-way journey and just have food and whatever is needed to kind of ride it out and just be a human science experiment that can potentially, serve mankind with some interesting sort of biometric data on what it is to be in space for that long. And also to just chart, to be like the Voyager probe, to just disappear onto the horizon in that way. That strikes me as a very kind of interesting and romantic way to die. If you're gonna, it sort of bakes into the premise. Like, I don't want to be launched off in a one-way journey today, for example, as a death sentence. But if it's impending, anyway, that was an interesting conversation, and it's one of those where, in a way, it informs you about the composer, I suppose. It certainly gives you an insight into where their head is otherwise.
Yeah,
so there you go. That's the best I can with this very interesting question.
That was a great answer. And yeah, I do it. I talk to interesting people on this podcast, and I learn a lot about their craft, even though there might be someone's cinematographer or something that's not related to my job, but I learn a lot, and I can kind of like connect all these dots together. And one thing that I'm always very interested about is the childhood of the people that I talk to. Let's go back about your childhood. What was going on? You were born in Denver, right?
Yes, in Colorado. Yep.
Yeah,
I was born like, yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was like, Austin's name is Austin. Is he from Austin? I don't know.
People assume that, you know. My mom is from Texas, and so you know, and my parents met in Texas. My family's from the South in general. I mean, in terms of the American wing, my family's very European German, but my dad grew up in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and then moved to Texas for medical school. And my mom was in college, and that's when they met. And so the Austin thing, I assume, is a little bit of an homage to those roots. And I've spent a lot of time in Texas and in the South visiting grandparents and things like that growing up. But yeah, no, very much in that way. I very much grew up in the Midwest. I always thought it was odd. To me, Colorado is the Midwest. And I always thought it was interesting that places significantly farther east, like Ohio and, you know, Illinois, are considered the Midwest. That was always, I was like, that's central. That's dead center, if not bordering on East Coast. Whereas if the West is California, shouldn't the Midwest be just shy of that, which is basically like Utah, Colorado, Wyoming? Shouldn't that be the Midwest? I've always been confounded by that because I've always identified with Midwest, but then I meet people who are from Ohio and they're like, no, we're Midwest. You're mountain. You're like West, I guess. Anyway, very funny. But yes, I grew up in Colorado.
And how do you think that your childhood, the environment that you grew up in, shaped your worldview and ultimately the kind of music that you make today?
You know, it's interesting because I grew up, some places are, some cities, some states, some countries or whatever are very kind of like a chameleon, where they're, or like a potpourri, you know, they're a grab bag of a bunch of different things. And then some have a real super strong sense of identity. You know, you think of like New York, you know, Brooklyn. There's a place that has a really particular kind of quality to it. And yes, of course, it's more nuanced than that. There's subsets, there's different neighborhoods within that. Or you think of like New Orleans. There's a place, it's like a brand, you know, it has a quality. Miami, that place, something specific about it. LA, you know, some people say that LA's problem is that it doesn't have that. I would beg to differ a bit. Chicago, you know, some of these places are just really of a certain kind of essence. And so if you grow up there, you kind of very oriented to that. Colorado is very much the opposite, at least when I was growing up. Even politically, for example, it's always been a purple state. It tends to swing back and forth between whether it goes red or it goes blue. Growing up, my friends and their families, their parents, were the entire political spectrum, you know, from probably very like progressive far left to moderate centrist left, like a Clintonian kind of left, you know, to center right to far right, you know, like you know, like evangelical Christian right versus, you know, George Bush Senior kind of middle-ish right kind of stuff, like everything, you know, and because that's what would have been up, you know, and it didn't think anything of that. I had friends who played in bands. I had friends who played in the orchestra. I had friends who didn't do any music. You know, we were video game nerds who also played sports together or would go hiking. Everyone seemed to kind of dip into lots of aspects of life. And because it wasn't like we're from here And this is the thing that people from here do. The way certain places have that quality, you know? Like, I'm from Boston. You're going to grow up in a very Boston kind of way. Here's what it means to be from Boston. To its credit, I don't think Denver really has that. And so anything that's of interest, you can probably find. You know, I did a lot of martial arts. I did a lot of scuba diving, and of course, music. So in hindsight, because I'm so interested in experimenting, I'm always trying to do something I feel like I've never really done before. Bonus points, it feels like no one's ever done it, but I care more to, above all, I want to feel like I can say I've never tried this. That's sort of a big goal for me every single time I do anything musically. And I feel like by luck that my childhood set me up for that, because it didn't feel like we're from here and people from here are this way. Like when you watch the movie Rudy and he says, you know, his father is trying to discourage him from going to Notre Dame because he says that, you know, being a Rudiger, it's Daniel Rudiger. He's part of the Rudiger family. Being a Rudiger, you know, we're not necessarily the best athletes or the top scholars, but you can have a great life as a Rudiger. You know, we work hard. We're proud. We're a great family. But going to big Ivy League school like Notre Dame, that's not that's not a Rudiger thing. And he has to like fight the gravity pulling him down to achieve his dreams, because there's a certain sense of, you know, we come from a steel factory kind of blue collar family, and that's what we do. And you need to keep going with that. There was none of that growing up. I was not told that way. My friends weren't told. It was, and people did all kinds of things. And my circle of friends, we ran the economic spectrum. You know, I had some friends that lived in full on mansions, and then other friends that, you know, they shared a 1-bedroom apartment with 2 siblings. You know what I mean? Like it was a real mix. In hindsight, I feel so lucky to have grown up with so many different types of people in that way. And it made me like an omnivore that's just kind of curious about, I don't feel like my whole musical world is this one particular identity of or in reaction to. I'm like an explorer that wants to just constantly go new places, because I don't fall back on some core ism that is just me. You know, that to me, that ism is like curiosity, is this just the desire to go somewhere I've never been. Whereas, you know, some composer friends are so identified by something so specific, and because they want to be. You know, I was just recently talking about Gustavo Santaolalla, for example. He's so specific in what he does, and that's what he wants to do. He doesn't want to do something different from that. To him, that's what brings him joy. You know, he picks up his Ron Rocco or the guitar, and he's super capable. You know, he's produced rock bands and hip hop and all kinds of stuff. He's legit. But it's sort of left to his devices. He has a very specific thing that he has a tendency to do, and it's very deep in his core. And I'm much more of a, I want to see what's over that next hill. And I think in hindsight, Denver was a very compatible place with that. It's hard to say if I was naturally like that and I happened to grow up in a place very lucky that facilitates that, or if I was a blank slate and because I grew up in a place like that, therefore I am that way. It's hard to know what's nature and what's what is reacting to what. The chicken and the egg kind of is dilemma here. But anyway, yeah, that would seemingly have played a part. I will say also a very crucial part of my childhood was that when I went to high school, I got to write music for my high school orchestra. And so if it is very that I got to go to a school, it was a public school, but it funded big school, 4,000 students. And it had a deep talent pool such that they had, you know, multiple orchestras, including the top level one was pretty good. And to have that as my playground, where the school teacher, the orchestra director in the school said, you know, you can write for us anytime you want. We'll play anything you put in front of us. And then he would put me on the podium and say, now you should conduct it. I'll show you how. I learned to write music by writing for my friends. I didn't ever I never knew what a DAW was until until college, until I was mostly done with college. To me, writing music was not a technology exercise. Writing music was a communal exercise with my friends. That hugely shaped my feeling of what music is. To this day, I don't think of music as an abstract concept. It's intimately attached to performers of who will be playing this or recording it or whatever. And that was created in that situation. Now, that's not specific to Denver, but I just happened to go to a school that had an orchestra program and stuff. I do a lot of nonprofit fundraising and stuff today in my life, because when I went out into the world as an adult, I realized how unusual my high school experience had been and how unfair that is. I didn't like the fact that me having an orchestra at my beck and call is so uncommon. I just assumed every high school had an orchestra, and anybody who was interested in music would have that opportunity. And when I realized I meet so few composers who had anything remotely like that in their childhood, I realized how crazy lucky I was. And I shouldn't have been. It doesn't feel just that my situation would be just so luck of the draw in that way. How easily my life could be so different if I hadn't had that opportunity. What creative capital are we missing out on as a society for that not being the case? So I try to do my part to facilitate it being less rare.
Yeah. Speaking of experiences, are there memories or that you return to emotionally when you're composing, something that helps you tap into a particular feeling, something that has happened to you, and the emotion is still with you, and you can use it in your creative process?
So yeah, that's really interesting. You are absolutely armed to the hilt with thought-provoking questions here. I would say I don't have any sort of go-tos in that way. It's always specific to what I'm trying to do. So if it's a project, that, like in the case of this game that I just released called Towerborne, that is supposed to be this big love letter to the kind of grand old-fashioned symphonic tradition. So suddenly I'm thinking about all those times, growing up, going to see the Colorado Symphony, or when, or living in LA, going to the Disney Hall or the Hollywood Bowl. All these memories I have of seeing an orchestra move like a flock of birds together. You end up. It's not just the technique you absorb by studying orchestration, by going to a concert hall. That's very important. That's a part of the actual craft. But even just the emotional experience of seeing how exciting it is to see all those bodies sort of move as one, that is a kind of thing that I would think about in the context of writing a score that is channeling that. But then, there's other projects where it's about something so much more intimate. I do have fun trying to be a little bit method from time to time. I remember that movie I mentioned that I was scoring, that horror film, Grace. It's not even really a horror film in my mind. It's more of a drama. But I remember when I was writing that score, I would turn my lights off in my studio, and I have no windows, so the light would be solely from my computer monitor, which of course was blinding and probably horrible for my eyes as a result. But I remember I would turn the lights off and I would crank the air conditioner. It was dark and it was cold, just to see how much that would influence the writing. It's not so much a memory for your question, but just curious how that affects it. Because surely it does. Writing music, I like to travel and write music in different places. I take like a little mobile rig with me. I remember I was writing a live kind of a theater piece a few years ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And I went with, she was my girlfriend at the time, my wife now. She's from Costa Rica. So I said, what if we went to Costa Rica and we rented like a cabin in the rainforest and just for a week? And she's a painter. So I said, you paint in the corner and I'll go to the other corner and just write music in my, in headphones in my laptop. Just because I'm curious what it's like to write music in a jungle, in a cabin with like monkeys and the trees outside. So we did that and it was great. You write differently, and part of it is some composers are very regimented. They have to start at the same time every day. They have their ritual. They need to make their coffee, or they need to have their cereal, or, you know what I mean, make their eggs and toast, whatever. Some people prefer to wake up late and then work late into the night, all that kind of stuff, but they have their kind of ritual way of working. I've always been the opposite. I prefer a chaotic, I like to not have a particular way of working. Sometimes I write first thing in the morning. Sometimes I don't start writing until 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And then some days I just kind of make the random decision where I go, I'm just not going to write today. Today's going to be kind of an email, you know, spreadsheet sort of a day. I prefer to let ideas just sort of marinate in the back of my head and not really make a plan until that morning, any of that sort of stuff. I know it's a bit of a tangent off of your question. Memories you're drawing from, or just how you set the mood, or whatever. Everything kind of informs how we do things. And I do find that if my goal is to be an explorer that does something I've never tried before, then I sort of can't have a process, because the process will railroad my decisions into being the same again and again, I would think.
Yeah.
At least I hope so. I bank on that being the case.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
About the process, what part of your process is still the hardest, or maybe just the most tedious, even after all these years?
I mean, this is probably a very obvious answer, but it's those first notes. Where do you start? I find that if most projects are on some level theme and variations are infinitely easier to write than theme.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean this in the broadest sense, defining the aesthetic, going, what is it that's going to make this thing what it is? You know, is this defined by, you know, like Towerborne? It's heavily defined by this sort of love letter to the traditional kind of capital R romantic 19th century orchestral sensibility, which means it has to be very hypermelodic. It has to be very kind of harmonically explorational. It doesn't rely on, you know, pop music, song form kind of approaches. It has to feel very sort of alive. It should sort of avoid percussion, because that's not 19th century music is not about rhythm. Usually in 19th century orchestral classical music, it's not really about rhythm in the way that the 20th century started to be. When you look at composers like Stravinsky and Bartók, who said, you know, we're under exploring rhythm and percussion as an element here, as one of our musical parameters. It was so predominantly about, you know, melody, contour, shape, structure, harmony, orchestral color. You know, when you what the orchestra comprised of in 1900, you know, as Beethoven was midway through his 9 symphonies. I mean, 1800. By the time you get to 1900, and you're looking at, you know, Debussy and Strauss and Mahler, and the concept of the orchestra changed so much in that period. So this proliferation of color, those are the things I start to think about. And then, of course, there's the operative words emotionally. In the case of Towerborne, it's something it's about optimism. It's about a joyousness, so that at its most dark, it's not really that dark. Whereas, you know, other projects like the Banner Saga, which was what I did with that same studio prior to Towerborne, it's sort of the opposite. It's a very restricted color palette. Wind ensemble, no strings. In many cases, it's very much about rhythm, but not flashy way. It's almost like a funeral dirge kind of way. And it is about a real, almost nihilistic darkness, you know, and a sort of hopelessness, but trying to find a kind of dignity and elegance within that hopelessness. Once figuring out all that stuff, to be able to say those few sentences is the first 15% of the project. Just sitting there staring at the blank page and going, well, what is the point of this? Does it even need music? And if it does need music, what is that music's fundamental point? And go from there. After that, then you're okay. Yeah, sometimes individual cues or individual scenes or whatever can be tricky to figure out for whatever reason. There's always problem child cues, where for whatever reason, as set up as you are with all your big ideas. There's just certain things that are, but generally speaking, it's sort of an exponential curve where writing the final 10% of the score is just multiple orders of magnitude easier than the first 10% of the score. That to me has just proven to be the case every time, no matter what we're doing. Even if it's a sequel, doing Banner Saga 2, where you've theoretically done so much of this work already, and now it's not really a blank page, even if it's a whole new score. There's still a lot of those questions, okay, well, what makes this one different? How does the story evolve? What new elements do we want to bring to the table? What elements can we maybe take off the table? So it's still the same basic question, even if you're given a little bit of a running start. But most projects aren't sequels, or at least in my case. I've worked on a bunch, and I've worked on sequels to my own projects, and I've also worked on existing franchises, like Assassin's Creed or something, where I'm stepping into something that someone else laid the initial bricks for. And even in those cases, there's still those same questions. It's always daunting to figure out where the hell to start.
Yeah, you mentioned questions that we ask ourselves when we start a project. But what kind of questions do you ask from the creator of that story? That's, for example, a Stoic with Towerborne.
Oh, yeah. No, I have a whole list of questions I tend to start with. I mean, I like to get all the pragmatic. It's not a scripted list or anything like that, but it is definitely it's sort of two categories of trains of thought. I will start by saying, I'd like to learn as much as I can, just pragmatically and logistically, what kind of game is this? What do you consider to be sort of games that people will naturally want to compare it with? In the case of Towerborne, we're talking about, Streets of Rage or other kind of like 2D or 2.5D brawlers, where they go, it's sort of that, but it's also, there's RPG elements to it. There's a social element to it. But so I like to start to just wrap my head around the basics, the pragmatic details of what are we trying to do? How are we supposed to fit in the kind of landscape of projects that are out there? But then I also ask more philosophical questions, which are ultimately the most important ones for kind of figuring out what the hell we're going to do, which is I will often say to them, what is this actually about? For example, a director friend of mine once said E.T. is his favorite movie about a boy and his dog. Where he just goes, that's a whole genre of film, the boy and his dog movies, like whether it's a boy or a girl and whether it's a dog or none of that matters. It's just like as an archetype. Or you think of, the Odyssey, the sort of the hero's journey home through all manner of trials, right? Very Joseph Campbell kind of archetypal. There's a lot of stories out there that more or less are that. And so I always like to ask them, what is this at bedrock? What are the archetypes here that actually matter? Towerborne, it's, I remember Arnie said, look, we've just spent 8 years or whatever making these Banner Saga games that are so heavy and dark because when we start them, we were, young men that wanted to explore something heavy because we were used to playing games that aren't that heavy growing up. You play Mario and Sonic and even, strategy games like Command and Conquer or Warcraft, or, we had all these games that we loved to play, and we wanted to explore something that's sort of more gritty than those. And then now, having done that, they all have young kids, 7, 8, 9 years old, that didn't like that game. It's too sort of boring for them. And I remember Arnie said, I want to make a game I can play with my kids and that they would want to play. That like they don't need me to pressure them to play. They want to play Dad's game, And that was such an informative and inspiring comment. I think about it. I thought about it every moment while working on the scores. This is a family game in the way that Wall-E or Ratatouille is a family film. It hits different wavelengths for what age you are, but it's approachable for any age. That's the goal. That's, to me, it's sort of the highest aspiration of all art, frankly. It's what makes Spielberg so amazing, is that, E.T. can rip your guts out at age 8 or age 80. And to me, Towerborne was meant to be joyously fun and infectious for a kid, or like a competitive e-gamer type or something, or like esports type player. I mean, like everywhere in between. If you're super hardcore and you want to play something that's competitive and gives you lots of challenges, make a game that's deep, but also a game that is very approachable and fun. If you're just a kid, or you want to play with your kid, that sort of thing, that sort of stuff where I just ask, like, what is the real mission here? What are we actually trying to achieve? That's so informative to the music. A way I sometimes ask that is I'll say to them, if you could write your fantasy review from, Game Informer or whoever is writing a review for your game, what are the things you want them to take away from it? And if the answer is, this should feel like a joyous celebration of classic games, versus, oh, the mechanics were super, and I love the way the combos work. You know what I mean? Like, he's like, I want something a little more deep than in my fantasy review takeaway about what we're trying to say to kind of classic games through this game. That sort of thing. So that's very often where we start. And it can be interesting, because over the course of a project, sometimes that evolves. Sometimes the point changes as the project comes to life. It kind of talks to you, and sometimes it can sort of convince you that it should be something else than what you started. And it can be an interesting challenge to let go of, oh, this isn't about that anymore. It shouldn't be about that anymore. We've kind of aged past that. And so a lot of projects, I think, actually, that don't turn out that well, often that's part of the problem. They're very committed to a thing that the project has kind of iterated away from, and then it ends up with this kind of schism internally where there's all these vestigial organs of where it began, whereas we should have just let it take us where it wanted to go. I'm generalizing, obviously, but I've seen plenty of projects. I suspected that is what happened, and I've certainly worked on some where it felt like that was happening. We were kind of in two places at once. We need to either double down on where we began, or probably better, just follow where it's taking us.
Wow.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I was actually listening to Towerborne soundtrack. I haven't got the chance to play the game yet, but I was listening to the soundtrack. Oh, congratulations, by the way, for the release of that. And honestly, after listening to that, I got curious about your childhood and all that question about your childhood, because it reminded me of my childhood. Like, all right, the mood I'm getting is, especially summer. So summer always reminds me of my being a kid and going out, being curious and all that. And listening to that during summer was like, this is so beautiful. It kind of like ignites a feeling inside me, and that's what I was curious about. And that is crazy that you mentioned that you were aiming for that.
That's amazing to hear. Honestly, that's incredible feedback. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Tehran, in Iran, far away from where you were born and raised.
Yeah, no, that's in a way that makes it even more amazing, because we aspire. You obviously you know this firsthand as an artist, as we aspire to make something that's hopefully universal. And even though I don't consider Western, like 19th century classical music, that's not universal. That's specific to a particular part of the world, a particular place and time. I'm sure what was going on in Iran musically in the 19th century is very different from that, in the same way that it's very different than what was going on in Japan, what's going on in the Americas, and onward, but it's amazing. It shows how small the world is in the best way, in the kind of Carl Sagan pale blue dot sense, that you can listen to that and it can evoke your childhood, which is undoubtedly very different from my childhood. I really love that. That sort of means more coming from you than if it had been someone who grew up down the street from me in Denver, who would have had a reasonably similar childhood, or rather, probably more accurately, it shows that those things are more similar than they're different, no matter where we're talking about, which is obviously that's always our kind of hope, naive or otherwise, about the world. But yeah, anyway, it means a lot to hear that. That's
awesome.
That's truly wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. So, Austin, I've got a segment on the podcast called Penny for Your Thoughts. It's where I ask some deep or sometimes dumb questions just to get to know my guests better. Are you ready for it?
I'm ready.
All right. The first important question. What DAW do you use?
Truly worth a penny. I'm one of the very few but proud digital performer users.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Next one. What piece of music from anything or anyone could be the soundtrack of your life?
Boy, I mean, that is so hard to say. I think my grand gold medal champion hero composer is Jerry Goldsmith. So it would have to come from Jerry, because I feel like I definitely got my desire to experiment from my early exposure to his music when I was growing up. I couldn't believe it. If I had to pick one single piece, I'd probably pick something like something from his score to Patton from 1970.
Wow.
Because I feel like that score is sort of the most perfect score ever written. Because I remember when I was in school, my music history professor talked about history as this, like the classical music, the history of classical music is this pendulum that swings back and forth between what he called the Apollonian ideal and the Dionysian ideal. Meaning Apollo is sort of the classical, you think of the Greeks, it's about form and structure. It's about elegance of design. This is quintessentially what the 18th century was all about. The era of Mozart and Haydn. The elegance of craft is above all else. Whereas the Dionysus is passion and romance. He goes, you think of the Baroque period with Bach and Handel, and where it was like roiling tempest of emotion and this experimentation coming out. And then after the classical period, we swung back to that with the romantic period, where things got it was so much about the individuality of the composer and extrapolated out to the idea of the nationalistic identity of composers. And then obviously the 20th century fractured 100 different directions, but one of the prevailing trends of the 20th century in classical music was, of course, this return to the Apollonian with the 12-tone music and serial techniques, and the idea that it's very much about something codified and structured. And so he said, so much of history and the literary movements have their own similar patterns, and the art world of painters and portraiture and all that is similarly back and forth. It's a sort of a truism that we have a tendency to indulge our passion and then to try to kind of become essentially, it's like our heart versus our head, back and forth, our intellect versus our soul. And so I'm realizing I got so far off in that I talked myself into a corner. I can't even remember what you asked now that spun me off into that. What was your question again?
What piece of music could be the soundtrack of your life? Could be music.
Oh yes, of course, yes. That's why I love Patton so much. Patton is the ultimate synthesis of the Dionysian, because it is an incredibly smart score where you just look at it and you go, the raw technique, the way that his themes all beautifully marry together in counterpoint, and the way they also perfectly capture these very cerebral concepts, like the use of trumpets passing through an echoplex to try to be reflective of the fact that George Patton really did believe he was a reincarnated soldier from ancient Carthage or ancient Rome fighting the Carthaginians. This idea of kind of a warrior echoing through time. It's a very Apollonian concept, very, very intellectual, but yet that score also bursts with passionate kind of, military fanfares that just get your blood going in a very non-rational way. To me, it's just it's absolutely the perfect influence of all the things that I love about both sides of that way of looking at art. So yeah, if I had to pick one, probably it'd be that one.
Wow, great one. So what's the last non-musical thing that made you feel deeply inspired?
Last non-musical thing. Interesting. I mean, I guess it depends what you mean. And the first thing that came to mind, there's probably other things since then, but in February I went to Maui with my wife, and it's whale season there in February, where all these humpback whales, like 15,000 humpback whales, will pass through Maui over about a 2-month period. And including many mothers to bring their calves to these shallow waters just off the coast, to nurse them and help them grow before they begin their multi-thousand-mile, trip back north. And we went out on a little boat for a couple hours and just watched dozens and dozens of whales jumping out of the water and whatnot. And I just find it terribly moving. I've spent a lot of time. I've done a lot of scuba diving, and I love being in the water. I love the ocean. I love sort of just being amongst, animals and coral and kelp forests and all that kind of thing. I just find it all really beautiful and really inspiring, and it's wonderful to just kind of disappear into the fabric of it all. And even though we were on a boat, I wasn't swimming with the whales or kind of trying to observe them underwater or anything like that. Still, just being surrounded, there were so many of them. And at one point, the person on the boat took a little hydrophone, sort of an underwater microphone, and threw it over the side attached to a speaker. And it just was this chorus. The thing has a couple mile radius of sound it can pick up underwater. And it just felt like there were 10,000 whales around us. I mean, there were so many. And I just find that sort of thing, it's one of those that's just, it's just wonderful and inspiring to just sort of feel part of the world. It's really easy as a composer to be in your little room and staring at your computer screen or staring at your paper, and to kind of forget that creating art, in theory or ideally, is sort of some kind of reaction to the world around us. And you have to go experience the world to make sure that the art you're creating has some connection to all that. And it's not just some internal feedback loop with yourself that's not really drawing on anything. It's often when I talk to younger composers and they say, what's one piece of advice that you would give? Frequently, my answer to that is, as hard as I encourage people to work on their craft, and, I am a big believer in thousands of hours should be invested in learning and constantly trying to expand what you can do. But you have to balance that with actually going and living an interesting life and being a person who tries different food and goes places that speak different languages than you, or has your heart broken, or goes to some part of town you've never been in without a map, all these kinds of things, whatever it is, whatever fits your lifestyle and wherever you are in the world and in life. But just make sure to live, to have experiences that will kind of mold you into someone that there's no duplicate of. And the more you are a nexus of novel experiences and memories, the more that becomes the case. Read a lot of books about different kinds of topics, and all that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that to me, I always encourage that. And I guess going and communing with the whales was, I guess, a little bit of me practicing what I preach in that regard. But I do find it very inspiring.
Yeah, great. So, I one time I talked to Raphael Lacoste, art director of the Assassin's Creed franchise, and I asked him about inspiration. He just said, "Go out for a walk in the park. You'll be surprised how much inspiration is out there." And an artist friend of mine listened to that podcast, and he said that changed his life. So like, just going out.
Oh,
and
wow.
I
love that.
Looked at the word in another way. Yeah.
Completely agree.
Yeah. All right. Next one. When was the last time you changed your mind about something important?
Mm. It's funny. I take pride in the fact that I'm very consider myself very persuadable. I don't irrationally hang on to things. There's this wonderful scientist and author and YouTuber named Julia Galef who wrote this book that everyone should read called The Scout Mindset, which is about this topic basically. And one of the things she mentions is this idea of that if we keep our identity small, then learning new information that might radically change our mind about something is not threatening because our identity is not wrapped into it. The bottom line is, when you keep your identity small, learning new information that makes you change your mind about stuff becomes relatively trivial, even if it's about a big topic. So I mean, look, I can think of a bunch of examples of things big and small. A kind of silly example that's probably the most recent is that I always, anytime anybody ever said, do you like to cook? I always would say, no. I just don't have the patience. I don't have the skill. I'm just not interested. But in the last 6 months, it has become like a thing I do with my wife. I like when we cook, and I have found myself really enjoying it for the first time ever in my life in the last 6 months, where we like try different recipes and we go to the store and we buy a bunch of stuff I've never bought before. And then we try it. She's way more naturally good at it. And so she can kind of improvise in ways that I never feel comfortable. I tend to, like, in direct contrast to how I work as a composer, I tend to analyze the recipe and follow it closely because I feel like I don't know how to go out on a limb without destroying it. I don't have that skill set, but it's obviously a very silly example. But I consider myself very open. I ask people about things all the time, you know, like the topic of AI comes up a lot. I tend to be an optimist. I say, I have a feeling that even though there might be some creative destruction and probably some jobs will be eliminated, most technological innovations historically have had a tendency to eventually yield net gain. By making this more productive in one area, it opens up other areas for people to explore and expand that otherwise might have been dormant because there wasn't a good return on that investment. But now we don't have to, worry about X. And also we tend to not bemoan, the horse and buggy industry that was put out of work by the car industry, though I guarantee you in the moment they were having a horrible experience. So if you're like a entry-level concept artist who is seeing generative AI eliminate your profession, I don't know if it will eliminate it or not. But things like it might come from my job too. I might have to figure out something different to do with my life. I don't know. But I tend to be optimistic about, if that's the case, it probably will open up whole new things that we don't even know about. No one could have even imagined the idea of all of the things that the internet enables you to do professionally, even just 30 years ago, or certainly 50 years ago. So I tend to be optimistic, but I have some friends. I had dinner with a friend last night who tends to be way more pessimistic about this stuff. And I listen to it, and he's very worried about certain things. And I listen to it and I go, look, my predisposition towards optimism doesn't preclude me going, that's a fair point. And it, so whether he convinced me and it's a true answer to your question, I don't know. But I do think it's good to be persuadable. I don't think grinding yourself into a position. I encounter this all the time with political conversations because people become so entrenched in this idea of my team versus the other team. My fantasy would be if we could eliminate political parties where candidates had to just say, here's what I believe. And you end up with this way more fine-grained spectrum of people sort of from right to left, because individually people are not so cut and dry. You might have somebody that's, very progressive, but happens to be anti-abortion. And like, that probably speaks to there's probably a lot of people that they're like, I am that combination of things, or somebody who's consider themselves very conservative, but they're very libertarian about abortion, so they're like, when we start to simplify everything and then become so entrenched in our camps. I mean, the dumbest ever is fucking PlayStation versus Xbox. You know, like it's insane. We factionalize ourselves. It drives me nuts. And so yeah, I think keep your identity small. Again, credit to Julia Galef for she's herself quoting an essay that the author of which I can't remember, but that keep your identity thing, because it makes you easier to persuade, which is good because you want to ideally find the truth and not feel threatened by it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of looking at it.
By the way, I unfortunately have to leave in just a couple minutes. I hate to say.
Yeah, this is it. Thank you so much, Austin. Your name and more importantly, your music is forever cemented in the history of video games, and your genius mind and beautiful heart inspire younger composers and warm the hearts of gamers. Thank you simply for doing your job so well. And I've always been in awe of your work. And after talking to you now, I'm in awe of your kindness, sir. Thank you.
Well, you are very generous. It's a privilege to be here. Like I said, you've spoken to many of my friends here, and also seriously, look, I've done probably hundreds of interviews over the last almost 20 years, and rarely, I can't think ever, honestly, of someone who every question is interesting. You actually really, you kind of kept surprising me every time, and I can't tell you how enjoyable that is. It makes me realize, boy, I probably should go binge every episode of your show, because I imagine every one of those conversations, I bet I will learn things about my close friends that I didn't know based on that. So seriously, huge credit to you for thinking in such an original and thought-provoking way. It's really a delight. I feel very privileged to have been here. So thank you.
Oh, this means a lot. Thank you so much, sir.